utterly transparent to me and helpful, very helpful. I did about a dozen screen caps that I can go back and look at later. I thought I could have just asked you for the PowerPoint, but that would have been too easy. So I did do the screen caps. So anyway, we're going to hear from Robert next week. We hear from Glenn, we hear from Jesse, and we hear from Jean-Michel.
Yes, next week.
Next week.
Okay.
Okay, Robert.
All right. Yeah, thank you very much. I'm really happy with the title of this. John sent me the notice that, we're going to do a conference on the presence of the future in us, and it immediately made me think of how we nurture the presence of the future in our children, because that's what I write about is education. And one of my projects in coming down to Mexico was to rewrite a book that I published in 2005, and I wanted to republish it as 2 volumes. So the first volume is called Teacher Seeking the Vocational Archetype. There's a chapter in there on philosophy and the classroom philosophy, and not to get into that, but what I came to was 3 basic conclusions about the way I didn't put it that way in the essay, but it fits perfectly into nurturing the presence of the future in our children. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Bob Dylan said the times they are changing. In fact, they're changing so rapidly that we might say that we no longer live in the present, but in the darkness of the potential of the future. And certainly there are many who seriously contemplate what kind of future will emerge from the darkness of the present. And there are those who understand that the future will emerge from the ways in which we nurture the presence of the future in our children. What I'd like to do in this talk is to outline 3 potential futures that are current and or are evolving, most specifically in the American educational system, though these 3 potential futures being nurtured in our children are indeed a global and international phenomenon. The first of those, which is the dominant vision of the future being propagated in our children, is something that I call progressive secular techno-modernism. And it's leading us toward the concept of transhumanism, where technology is going to impose itself on defining humanity's future. In an excerpt from my current book, I said this about the future that we are currently nurturing in our children. This is from the chapter on philosophy in my current book. The purpose of education that appears to be most prominent today is progressive secular techno-modernism. This purpose is led by STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, a common core curriculum, outcome-based standardization, testing, and assessment. It emphasizes the occupational purpose of education to create a workforce that can evolve with advanced technologies. The humanities are de-emphasized. Socialization takes place under the concept of secular humanism that leads to standardization of behavioral outcomes enforced by peer pressure and judged by social media. Teaching the continuity of human culture is giving way to the techno-human interface, or transhumanism, divorced from the human cultural continuum. And the child's highest potential may soon be determined by the quality of his or her chip implant. We've all seen this future in television and in the movies, and there are those who welcome it. So let's begin by defining these terms, secular and techno-modernism, and look at how they are woven into the definition of the future. Secularism has been popularized as a concept through the idea of secular democracy, which Biden talks about a lot, and secular humanism. And secular humanism arose out of what was originally called religious humanism, which actually meant the religion of humanism. And that has been codified in the first Humanist Manifest of 1933. Humanism in that manifest is defined as guided by reason, inspired by compassion, and informed by experience. The key issues of secular humanism begin with the concept that it is grounded in the idea of good without God. Secular humanism is based on reason, ethics, science, and compassion, not on religion belief, religious belief, or dogma. Secular humanism is grounded in scientific integrity, social justice, and peace. All of that sounds pretty good. In the Humanist Manifesto of 1933, there are 15 key points or articles, some of which are: religion must formulate values in the light of science. That is, mysticism is not a valid part of the religious experience. The times for such concepts as theism, deism, and modernism have passed. There is no distinction between the sacred and the secular. Emotions and beliefs are not associated with the supernatural. Reasonable, and remember this was 1933, reasonable and manly attitudes are fostered in education. This Humanist Manifest was updated in 1973 and updated one more time in 2003. And in 2003, it says this: knowledge of the world is empirical. It is acquired through observation, experiment, and rational interpretation. Compare this to what I wrote about the Greek sophists and atheists responding to the mystery cults in ancient Greece. The sophists and the atheists profess that the only truth that can be humanly known is immanent, not transcendent. Immanent truth is only accessible to direct empirical observation and human intellectual reason, not mystical interperception. Thus, all causes of natural phenomena should be sought in the realm of observable nature, not in the supernatural projections of a mythological imagination. The ways of knowing are dominated by observation, formation of images and ideas based on those observations, and the mental processes of interpretation and critical analysis. All knowledge is relative and must be constantly revised in the light of new evidence and new analysis. There is no transcendent knowledge or truth. Everything is relative. That's very similar to what the Humanist Manifesto says. All knowledge of the world is empirical, acquired through observation, experiment, and rational interpretation. This rational perspective comes to dominate and eventually subsume the collective spiritual imagination of the culture, perhaps giving us an oxymoronic definition of culture that we, as we try to reconcile secularism and culture. As T.S. Eliot said, there is no, secularism does not fit with culture because culture is essentially spiritual. So let's come to this term of techno-modernism. Excuse me. There are three basic periods of modernism. Modernism began about the turn of the 20th century and lasted till about the late 1960s. And from the late 1960s to the early 1990s, postmodernism took over. And then since the 1990s, we were in this period that can be described as techno-modernism. Modernism arose out of a search for sane and salient understanding of the self, society, and the world in a period of great instability propagated by the introduction of new technologies in manufacturing, that is, in the factories, in transportation, in the electrical grid, in military technology, in photo and graphic technology, and in the revolutions against colonialism and capitalism. But these ideas of modernism died as a result of the failed dreams of science, the myth of progress, the failed promises of revolutions, and the liberation of repressed desire. Postmodernism took form in the late 1960s under the generally considered one of the major prophets is Jean Gebser, the French philosopher, who wrote about deconstructionism, and this deconstructionism of the cultural canon is what he was looking at. this idea of deconstruction of the cultural canonism. Canon is what leads to postmodernism. And it says that postmodernism, this is a quote from someone by the name of Douglas Kellner, postmodernism will decide what experiences and signs in one's reality will be one's reality as they know it. What experiences and signs in one's reality will be one's reality. This is, in a sense, a break from one's human cultural heritage or the cultural continuum of humanity. And we recall that deconstructionism came into effect about the same time as what was called the counterculture. And I have different ideas on that. But if you look at a kind of a progression, the counterculture led to this idea in the 1990s and early aughts of political correctness. And now we have the woke culture. And now we have this concept, which frightens me a lot, of called cancel culture. And that has all resulted in the cultural wars in America. Techno-modernism emerged with personal computers, cell phones, and the process webs of all the media. We live in a technological society that is an inescapable digital media ecosystem that we Am I back?
Yeah, you're back.
Okay. Yeah, I forgot to mention that at the beginning of this talk. My computer has blanked out twice already, but now it's 3 times. I hope that's it. So we live in a technological society that is an inescapable digital media ecosystem, a cyborg dome. These technologies undermine democracy by providing the mechanisms for turning ideologies, and we can relate to this in the Trump era, the mechanisms for turning ideologies into personal truths that shape behavior and tribalize society. So here is the presence of the future that we are nurturing in our children, or the dominant model. We are nurturing a secular worldview that is dominated by this deficient mode of mental consciousness. We are teaching children to adapt to and participate voluntarily in the inescapable digital media ecosystem. Think of the last time you saw a 3-year-old with a cell phone. Accessibility and possibilities of living in augmented and virtual reality, and a term that I saw quite recently on the internet, quiet quitting. Quiet quitting has social, cultural, and economic reality to it. But the economic reality is that people go to their jobs and they only do the minimum to get paid. They can go home, lay on their couch, have everything delivered by Jeff Bezos robots, and sit there and live in virtual reality. There was a manifesto of techno-modernism on the internet written by somebody by the name of Cory Bobvo. And this is what he says in his manifesto of techno-modernism. It is reasonable to fear that as the capabilities of computer technologies such as data science and algorithms which analyze sentiment and generate text, audio, and visual content continue to develop, dystopian dreams of today will fully realize. These will be realized in procedurally generated propaganda, adapted to all of the psychographic market segments one is linked to via online databases, or in made-up news articles, conspiracy theories, and calls to action, either outlined in a template or articles entirely written by neural network-powered bots like GPT-2. That was one I had to look up. GPT-2 stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. Second generation. It is an open source for artificial intelligence. So he says that by neural network powered bots like GPT-2, which might one day so successfully, and think about the Trump era again, one day so successfully manipulate the dreams and fears of some portion of the population that not even retraction of the article can undo the effects of the article on public opinion. Some argue quite convincingly that this day has already come. So my question as a teacher and involved with child development is, what is the effect on young people? And the effect, I feel, is a disassociation from the human cultural continuum because we're not teaching it in the schools. And this results in a depression and alienation, which ultimately, in some children, leads to suicide and murder in the schools. Alienation, depression results from social and academic stress during the school year and a history of neglect and abuse in the home or the home environment. And this is particularly true of LGBTQ young people and is measurable at a rate of about 50% of LGBTQ young people suffer from this alienation and depression. Alienation, depression. Here's a couple of statistical examples. In the past 2 years, and the pandemic is part of that, but screen time for tweens and teens has increased by 17%. 40% of 8 to 12-year-olds are on social media. Those who spend 5+ hours a day on social media are twice as likely to have suicidal tendencies. With statistics on mental health issues among young people growing, some school districts have implemented mental health days, like sick days. What statistics do show is that out of an adolescent population of 13 to 19-year-olds, a population in the United States of about 25 to 30 million children, 1/6, or about 5 million, contemplate suicide every year, and there are about 1 million attempted suicides in this age group with no warning behaviors. 3 million adolescents experience major depression. There are growing statistics as well of children as young as 8 and 9 years old contemplating suicide. And in a 2020 report by the CDC, 1 in 12, 9 to 10-year-olds, about 8% of the 9 to 10-year-old population contemplate suicide. In the same report, 500 children, 10 to 14 years old, and 6,000 youths, 15 to 24, attempt suicide in 2020. Alienation and depression lead not only to self-harm, but to rage, which is turned against society and among young people, particularly against the schools. In the US, from 2009 to 2018, there were 288 school shootings, and the next country, which by the way was Mexico, there were, in that same 9-year time period, there were 8 school shootings. In 2022 alone, there have been 113 school shootings, resulting in 41 deaths and 82 injuries. This is just a brief example of the cultural depression that we all feel from the despiritualization of the moral and ethical compass of our cultural identity, not just in the United States, but in other nations as well. In the United States, progressives, even among very liberal progressives, they cling to this secular techno-modernist vision that seems to capitulate to the inevitability of transhumanism because they have not formulated an alternative. And this becomes a very political issue, as you'll see in this next segment. On the other hand, Republican conservatives have their own agenda for re-spiritualizing the culture. So here is alternative number 1. We can call this the patriotic or 1776 curriculum in the schools. Opposing the science fiction aberration of secular techno-modernism is the traditionalist vision to maintain the continuity of the national cultural identity of the United States as the primary mandate of the public trust of public education. It asserts that the American cultural identity was defined by European Protestant nativists, and it must be revived and taught in the K through 12 education system as the dominant national cultural identity of the United States, to which all other racial, ethnic, and religious groups must submit and assimilate. The objective outlined by the Trump administration's 1776 commission was the formation of a core patriotic curriculum. This curriculum is now being implemented in some states. So what is the objective? It is to restore the conservative cultural identity and enforce compliance to cultural norms established by the dominant cultural model. We are all beginning to realize that this dominant cultural model is regressive, religious nationalism, or maybe a semi-democratized theocracy. So how did this patriotic curriculum arise? Donald Trump and Betsy DeVos in September of 2020 gave a speech where they advocated for a revision of the American history curriculum. The American history curriculum is taught as a spiral approach in either the 4th or 5th grade, again in the 8th grade, and then again in the 11th or 12th grade, with AP designed into that. And what they were proposing, what Trump and DeVos proposed, was a response to the New York Times article of the 1619 Project. And the objective, it was designed to teach children, quote unquote, the miracle of American history. And then again in December, actually after the election, it was on, I've forgotten the date, December of 2020, Trump and DeVos came together again, and they announced the formation of the 1776 Commission, which was to teach this patriotic K through 12 curriculum and all the traditional American values. But of course, Biden disbanded that commission, I think, on his first day in office. But having been announced from the bully pulpit, this new emphasis in K through 12 education policy, which is actually a prerogative of the states, is now being implemented in about 27 states. Here's a statistic for you. Unrepentant Christian nationalism in the United States appeals to about 20% of the general population, and this unrepentant Christian nationalism appeals to 36% of Republicans. For example, there is, and I'm sure you've already heard, some of you have already heard that some members of Congress have called already for a repeal of the First Amendment, the separation of church and state. There is also a conservative push for biblical Bible classes in schools. It's called Project Blitz. And Project Blitz is an effort of the Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation. It's active in about 10 states. Its objective is to encourage Bible literacy in opposition to, and this is a quote from a Washington Post article, in opposition to Reform Judaism, Hinduism, Muslims, and more liberal Christian creeds like Episcopalians, Presbyterians, and Methodists. And during that 2020 campaign between Trump and Biden, Donald Trump Jr. gave a speech in El Paso, Texas, and this is what he said. He urged young conservatives to bring all of these values to your schools, which results in a bullying in the schools and further alienation and depression among those who refuse to conform to the patriotic Christian nationalist ideology. So fortunately, we have another option. Oh, let me finish this out. Oh, issues taught in the schools: nativism, white supremacy, patriarchy, heteronormative, divine sanction of authoritarian control. This is part of that manifest: divine sanction for authoritarian control and militarism. These are the issues taught in the school. Self-identity is formed from, one, the interpretation of history, which is taught in the schools under a particular ideology, sacred symbols, which are usually taught in the churches, cherished values, which are social values, or values of the cultural superego, and public policy. Self-identity is formed from interpretation of history, sacred symbols, cherished values, and public policy. There's a college in central Michigan called Hillsdale College. And this actually goes back to the Reagan administration, but the Hillsdale College is supported by the DeVos Family Foundation, or whatever it is, and the Prince Family Foundation. Betsy DeVos's maiden name is Prince. And while it's an ultra-conservative Christian college in central Michigan, and it became prominent during the Reagan administration when the college itself changed administrations and became even more conservative. But it has now established a consultant service which is nationwide for establishing what they call the Classic Academy. The Classic Academy basically teaches history, and it's a cultural education program is what it is, and it teaches that the American cultural identity starts with the Greeks and Romans all the way up to the present, and the infiltration of Christianity, and particularly Protestant Christianity. But this consultant service to establish the Classic Academy is a charter school. And the objective is to recover public education from 100 years of progressivism. The 1776 curriculum is to inform patriotism. In 13 states, there are 24 schools nationwide now who are training teachers for the Classic Academy. So that's certainly one alternative future that we will be nurturing in some youth in America anyway. Alternative number 2 is spiritual democracy. My friend Stephen Herman, who's a Jungian psychologist that some of you may know, lives up in Berkeley, has been writing about spiritual democracy. He wrote a book called Spiritual Democracy and the Visionaries of American Visionaries for a Way Forward. He writes on this foundation of the concept among the transcendentalists of the 1840s and 50s, of which he speaks specifically about Walt Whitman, Herman Melville, Emily Dickinson, and of course Thoreau and Emerson, and so on. And just to give you a progressive line of this concept, I mean, the concept of spiritual democracy really comes out of Walt Whitman. And there's a direct line that we can follow that. The next step would be William James, and William James' concept of the variety of religious experiences. And then, of course, Carl Jung and the concept of individuation. The concept of individuation lies at the foundation of the holistic education movement, or the ideas of holistic education, and yet it's never been completed, because what holistic education is really about is developmental individuation, and that's something that's not talked about very much in the Jungian community, but it's a particular subject that I'm involved in. And of course, Jean Gebser's integrality. And Gebser talks about it in terms of the spiritualization of the personality. And that's how you spiritualize the culture, spiritualize democracy through the spiritualization of the personality. I wrote about this in an essay called Individuation and the Culture of Democracy. And I talk about the Greeks. Basically, the Greek cults and the American Indian Vision Quest. So these are both methods toward spiritualization of the personality, which is exactly what Gebser talks about. So what I wrote in my essay that I was telling you about the re-spiritualization of cultural and cultural identity is this: the spiritual humanist purpose, I call it spiritual humanist or spiritual democracy, purpose of education is to both educate the mind and to nurture the soul. The objective is an individuated citizen, that is, an integral personality as the individual's highest potential. It teaches the continuity of human culture because that curriculum fits best with the American cultural diversity. It socializes the individual by teaching the sanctity of the individual as expressed in the arts, literature, and religion of all cultures, seeing the sanctity of the individual in each other. You may some of you may recall that Jimmy Carter very often talked about the sanctity of the individual. It teaches young people to seek their calling, that is their vocation, rather than just learn the skills to find a job. And the objective of this spiritual humanist purpose of education is, in fact, to create an individuated citizenry. So there are two ways to accomplish this, both of which are things that I've written books about. This first book, my book called Teacher Seeking the Vocational Archetype, is simply about the nurturing aspects of the teacher's personality. And it comes from seeking that archetype, that vocational archetype in the personality, in your own personality as a teacher. The individuation of the teacher or the integration of the teacher's personality is primary to nurturing the souls of the children. There are 6 characteristics that I point out as characteristics of the teacher archetype. One is storytelling. All kids of all ages love to hear stories. Arts, because arts, if you propagate the arts in children, it helps them to express things that they can't express rationally. And drama. Every classroom, every teacher, every age group, you can do all kinds of dramatic presentations with kids, and they love it. Scholarship. The good teacher or the teacher archetype is a scholar of the subjects that he or she teaches. And the philosophy of education, well, the philosophy of education for the classroom, not the nation, but for the classroom is very simple. And that is that it's your job as a teacher to teach the mind and nurture the soul. And of course, the psychology of individuation, which I call, or the psychology of education, which I call developmental individuation. So that's basically that concept of individuation is a Jungian concept. And the teacher seeking the vocational archetype of the teacher is basically being able to see the archetype in the child. Well, in every child, there's the divine archetype. And in every adolescent, it's the heroic archetype. And in the adults, it's several. It's the parental archetype, it's the vocational archetype, and there are others that pertain to adults. But that aspect of it comes into what I talk about elsewhere in developmental individuation. That's the Jungian part of it. The Gebser part of it is the curriculum. Gebser's model of developmental individuation is based on recapitulation theory. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. So I'm just going to close with this very short quote from Gebser, which really, to me, sums up the kind of curriculum that we need to be teaching in the K through 12 system. And I did a little bit of I did this kind of this presentation basically of this curriculum when I was talking at the Asilomar conference. So what Gebser says is this: by returning to the very source of human development as we observe the structures of consciousness unfold, we can not only discover the past, but also gain a view into the future which reveals the traits of a new reality amidst the decline of our age. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Robert.
Thank you, John.
And welcome to you, Jean-Michel. Welcome to our group. We look forward to your presentation next week.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here too.
Jean-Michel.
I have many responses. I expect there are many responses amongst the group, and so who would like to go first? All right, Mike.
Well, it's just a quick thing, and that is that those who have been working with AI and training them right, and training them to be more, could we say, constructive, and they asked AI, can we trust AI? And all the programs said no.
Well, I think there's some very positive aspects to technology. I think this is what the modernists were all about. Their objective in looking at how it affects self-society in the world was to try to find a way to contain it or to control it or to give it a purpose. And the way that I see it is that technology needs to have that cultural purpose. Well, if you don't teach culture in the school, but you can change that whole STEM curriculum. I mean, there are kids out, the young people out there. There's a young group of 20-year-olds who are out trying to clean up the Pacific Ocean. I mean, that's technology at its best, serving humanity, and these are young people doing that. But it's also very frightening, yes.
If you're interested in a really good organization that's working to realize and counter the effects of technology, it's the Center for Humane Technology.
Yeah, that sounds very reasonable.
Yeah, they're doing a nice job.
Can you send me the link to that? I would appreciate that.
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat for everybody.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Robert?
I
Yeah,
just wanted to, oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, Mike, I'm sorry, Robert, I just wanted to say that I found like everything that you spoke about. I mean, that it's quite a powerful thing you just read, and I was and put together, and I mean, I was kind of mesmerized by it as you're reading. I mean, it was such great information, which some of which I kind of know about just by reading the newspaper or whatever and staying apprised of things, but the focus that you brought to it and just kind of the frighteningness of it, and just how important these poor little ones are who are like at 8 years old thinking about committing suicide because society is just so empty for them. And I'm going to ask you a question, but I mean, and it also kind of leads up to this whole, the school system has turned into this incredible battleground where, teachers are under attack, where what's being read is being questioned and, quarantined off or whatever. And anyway, so I love so much all of your thinking, and I'm wondering, I don't really know about how you're, putting forth your vision into the world, because it feels to me like it's incredibly important and vital.
Well, I have this book that I'm working. It's in publication right now. It's called Teacher Seeking the Vocational Archetype.
Okay.
And it's a hybrid book of memoirs of basically from my first 15 years of teaching. And it incorporates this essay that I brought up these 3 points from. And it talks about, because what I did was I had written the chapter, and then there was a lot of talk in the media at some point, 2 years ago or whatever it was. They were talking about the purpose of education. And so it was in that essay or in that chapter. So I broke it down. I took an essay of 3,500 words out. I tried to publish it in 10 different publications. They all rejected it. But it's a really solid essay about not the philosophy of education that governs the culture of the society, but the philosophy of education that the teacher wants to have in the classroom, that this is your responsibility, not just to teach the mind, but to nurture the soul.
Yeah.
And every good teacher knows that, but they are under attack, as you said.
Right.
And partly for that.
Right.
That's why I think a lot of them quit during the pandemic. They said, if I can't be in the classroom with my kids where I can see them and feel them and nurture them, then I don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, just beautifully summarized and thought about and done. It was great.
Well, let me talk about the other book because I wrote a book. I wrote a book on the curriculum too, and the book is now called. I keep changing titles, but the new title is E Pluribus Unum, K through 12 curriculum for the future of democracy. And in that one, I kind of outline 3 periods of, I would call it the transformation in consciousness of American society. The first one was in the schools, it was acculturation to a specific cultural model, which is what the conservatives want to go back to. But that was the first one. It lasted until 1920. And then we came in with the socialization model. And the socialization model is still partly there. But then in the 1960s, we came in with the technological model for education with Eisenhower's Educational Defense Act just after Sputnik went up in 1957. Anyway, so those are the 3 periods, and that kind of leads in also to this whole thing about where modern techno-modernism comes from. This concept of secular techno-modernism has been a product of the socialization period in American education and this technological period in American education. And then I have a full K through 12 curriculum. A cultural curriculum. Go ahead, Glenn.
No, that's okay. That's okay. You've got a lot to say on the subject. So, and thank you very much for putting these thoughts out there. I just want to respond a little indirectly, but and maybe get your response to what I'm saying. In a lot of Native American cultures, there will be a wisdom council followed by kind of a council that's more in charge of actions, often divided into women's councils and men's councils, because men are good at getting things done, but we need some direction, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And also, you know, if you look back in American history, which I'm sure you've done, you know, the earliest discussions between, you know, the battle of the pamphlets between Edmund Burke and Thomas Paine, you know, outlined some of the debates in a more intelligent way, I would say, than what's going on today between the battles of the techno-modern and the conservative movements. But I wonder if some of that can be recaptured, because it seems to me, I mean, there's 2 movements in nature, you know, one to progress, if you want to call progress or unfold, and another one that pulls back and sees the wisdom of the cycles of nature. Can you, I guess my question would be, can you speak more about your third option, you know, your Gebserian option in terms of temporality? Because I just, you know, how can that mitigate and include the forces that are pitting against each other for the progress or the pullback to conservative values? Does that make sense?
Not quite. But you're getting there. Try it again.
Well, okay. You know, because Michael, you know, in Michael's talk, he just took he very directly spoke about Gebser's presencing of the future within us.
Uh-huh.
So it seems to me that the battle, I'll try to rephrase it, the battle between the techno-modern and the conservative has to do with time. It has to do with how they perceive of time.
Well, yeah, I think
third way, yes, that you can.
The Trumpians are going backwards.
Yeah,
that's the basic model for Trump's future is the 1950s. or the Trumpian version of America's in the 1950s. And if you see that in Supreme Court rulings, you see that in what was really fascinating to me was finding out about this Hillsdale College, because that's very much under the wire. Nobody ever talks about what's going on at that level of education, how the different states are developing new educational policies that are being affected in the schools that support this 1776 or patriotic curriculum. So that's one going backwards. Now the techno-modernists, as I see them going forward, it has to lead to transhumanism. I mean, that's the direction that it's going. You know, chip implant. Elon Musk has been experimenting with chimpanzees with chip implants in the brain, and there are thousands of people who are signed up already to be the first guinea pigs for that, because they want to have a chip implant. So the Gebserian model is, first of all, you have to teach the cultural curriculum. You have to teach the continuum of human culture. And of course, Gebser and Jung both are into recapitulation theory. Gebser is, I think he's much more erudite on the subject than is Jung. Jung doesn't talk a whole lot about it. But what you can do with that, say you're talking about the magical mode of consciousness. The magical mode of consciousness is basically from maybe 1 until about 5 years old. That's when it's most dominant, maybe not even 5. And then the mythical mode of consciousness comes in and takes over until the early teens, the tweens. And then about 14, Jean Piaget talked about the transformation between concrete and what do you call it?
Formal operational thinking.
Yeah. And that's when you get into the mental process of thinking. So the thing is to mitigate the process would be to mitigate the influences of this deficient mode of mental consciousness. What I see it in Jungian terms, and I presented this at Asilomar, is that in Jungian terms, you've got the ego emerging out of the ever-present origin, or the Godhead within, or however you want to call it, and making this beeline toward to become absorbed in cultural consciousness, the dominant cultural consciousness, which is ego consciousness. And as Neumann says, the cultural superego is the seat of consciousness. So then it's a whole rebellion in order to get back. I mean, the individuation process is a whole rebellion. And Gebser has a take. I wrote about this. I don't have the quote available to me right now, but Gebser's perception of that same individuation process is very similar to Jung's, but it's different. Now, how do you get to that in the school system? Well, in my way of thinking and the way I presented it, and at Asilomar, I presented the alternative model, which was defined by William Irwin Thompson. And William Irwin Thompson takes the whole recapitulation theory and Gebser, and he talks about Ken Wilber a lot, but his basic idea is that. And it's so rigorous and so difficult for teachers to even learn it. And I think that my concept is a lot simpler. And first of all, you don't start that regressive looking at culture the way that Gebser says it, by returning to the very sources of human development as we observe the structures of consciousness unfold. You don't even start that until about the 6th grade, because then the child is getting into mental consciousness, so that's where you're integrating. So you're talking about things that are happening in the cultural continuum. You're talking about things that are happening in magical consciousness or levels of culture that are embedded in that earlier mode of consciousness, and you're bringing it forward for the kid. you're bringing it up into mental consciousness at an age when they're ready to do that. So does that answer your question, Glenn? About how the difference is, but in the time zones and.
Well, it's okay. I won't take any more time. But thank you. Thank you. Yeah, yeah. Go ahead. Let's move on. Yeah.
I'm this area, Robert, as you know, concerns me deeply. I also taught at secondary level for about 20 years, and then have taught at actually every level of education. But concretely, as I always reference, I think directly in terms of my 5 grandchildren, who range in age from 1 to 12. Also, my firstborn son, who is a teacher of history in the Seattle public school system. He teaches at middle school level, middle school in a highly diverse neighborhood in South Seattle. And he teaches 8th grade U.S. history and world cultural history too. So right on this, and we are in continuous communication, my son and I, about what he is working with in the classroom and what he's working with his colleagues, day by day by day. Of course, classroom teachers have a sense of this that I think is hard to come by if one has not been a classroom teacher, and that is it is absolutely day by day by day by day for an entire school year, and it involves everything, parent, administration, and politics. Sort of moving through that, if you will, just take that outlay. What my concern that arises for me, Robert, when you're speaking, and it arises in my previous readings of your writings, is just the immediate or the to be immediately expected attack that you're trying to impose some sort of ideological program a la Carl Jung and Jean Gebser. I mean, these are not exactly names that are going to make it in the debate of public education per se. But then how do these truths, if we will, for the moment, accept these as truths, or Gebser gives us the term volition. And I've had, for me, it's hard in some conversations simply to describe a differentiation between the truth and truthfulness. And I think Gebser does give us tools, many tools, untoward truthfulness. And of course, that if I were to say one thing that I see as most dangerous in our world, cultures, and politics today, I could start with a loss of truthfulness in public life, public discourse, so that truthfulness has been subverted, as you say, to techno-modernism. We can get into that. That would be very fertile, and I would enjoy doing that, talking about that with you. But that is, what is it to be truthful? Has that been replaced by an algorithm? Well, we'll plug in a truthful algorithm, according to whoever is going to create that algorithm. But I'm drawn to your work specifically, and I'm about done here, to communication amongst the community of teachers. And I would say teachers who have a commitment to truthfulness. If we say truth, then we're going to have a fight immediately on our hands. It's throwing a match into a pool of gasoline. Truth. But to say, well, but what about truthfulness, which requires dialogue? since truthfulness would mean that none of us can proclaim in a fascistic dictatorial way what the absolute truth is. But we can say it is vitally important to be truthful.
Yeah,
and I think your
exactly.
writing can be very helpful there. And I just want to say that.
Yeah, I've talked about that a little bit. I talk about it in terms of truth sayer. I say that in fact, in the book, I write about some of the reasons why people choose to be teachers, and one of those reasons is that they are seekers of the truth, and they want to propagate that concept of seeking the truth in young people. So, what is the truth anyway? The truth is not really a mental concept. The truth is something that you just have an inspirational moment and it just comes to you, and you just know that it's coming from a very deep inner voice. And for that, it has to be true, or true for that particular instance in that moment. That's why I think people can be truth sayers, but there's no one who knows all the truth, because the whole truth can never be known mentally.
Well, that circles back, just to make a connection with our conversations today. That circles back to, I think it was in your presentation, Mike, where Gebser says this is always open work.
Mm-hmm.
Always open work.
Yeah.
Always dialogue.
I appreciate that synchronicity. I was listening to Mike's talk, and I thought, there's so much of this is sort of precedes what I'm doing. There's always that kind of synchronicity in these conferences, which is wonderful. I love that.
I appreciate your hanging in there, and I always want to read the latest thing that you've ever written. So be sure to keep me up to date on that.
I got an idea on that, John. Yes.
But I will circle back again to my grandchildren, because when I look, into their faces, I will be a memory, hopefully at some point. As grandfather, I will become a part of the memory structure. When I look in their faces, and I think we are now in the third decade of the 21st century, the third decade of the third millennium. That's where we are by those temporics.
Mm-hmm.
And my 1-year-old grandson, and then my 12-year-old grandson, and I have one granddaughter in the middle, by the way. How to teach them anything at all about the world they are living into. So I start with a lot of humility. And then I do come, and I'm going to quit here because I'm talking too much, but I know that I need to be granddaddy. I need to be granddaddy. My grandchildren aren't terribly comfortable with my sculptures, but they're not frightened or terrified. They just don't actually understand what's going on. But to communicate with them and to listen to them and to have great love for them and trust for them. And again, we're getting then into the archetype of the teacher. What is the archetype of the teacher? And I know you've written on that. It's very important.
Well, just to say something about that, I think what you're saying to the young ones about the future that they will live into, it's more that sense than trying to tell young people that this is the future, this is what you're going to have to do, and this is the way it's going to be. Because we're in an age now when these young people, and I think a lot of them do realize that the future is not something which has already been determined, that they are the future, that they are going to be able to create the future. So that's what I think we really have to instill in all young people these days, is that sense. The future is not set by whoever's ideology seems to be dominant at the moment. The future is something that you are going to very much become a part of creating.
I can't remember who said it, but a friend of mine reminded me of a quote that the future of learning will have to do with being able to unlearn and continually relearn. You know, that we're moving into an age where things are changing so fast that the ones who will succeed are those that can unlearn and relearn the fastest.
Yeah. Lisa, that's very in tune with what Leroy Little Bear would say. You know, that education is renewal, and you have to empty out, and then yeah, it's beautiful, actually. Thank you for that.
I like this. I like this course of our conversation. And I just, in a quick aside, Robert, I think Neumann can come in here helpfully, but somehow circularity, the circulation, and I can even go back with you, Mike, and Nietzsche, and the eternal return that he's working with, and this and that. But I think with Gebser, this is also, and here I'm just speaking off the top of my head, but Gebser is saying with this notion of the at once, as he says, rather than to think, he uses this term at once, at-once, the at once. Now I can feel that, and I've confessed to you already today, and I'm always confessing because it is the truthfulness of my situation. I feel overwhelming anxiety. I start every morning sort of being overwhelmed with anxiety. Now that blends into my personal material. That's here too. But then to think, because of the terrific questions we have for which we do not have answers, but then just back to what you were saying and what everybody's saying, this circulation of our human beingness. And I think at that moment, I'll make a leap into Jean-Michel's presentation on Sri Aurobindo, because I think Aurobindo can be helpful to us here as well, of the circularity of the being of beingness, and that's too much, so I'll stop there. I've gone too far.
Well, no, can I make a segue between Aurobindo and a question for you, Robert? Because I'd like you to speak a little more about it's another book, apparently, that, you have a book based on curriculum.
Yes.
That you're calling E Pluribus Unum.
E Pluribus Unum, out of many
Because
words.
that seems to be in consonance to spirit with Aurobindo's unity and diversity, or something, perhaps. But if you can share something about that, that'd be great.
Well, I don't know a whole lot about Aurobindo. I know the Gebser and Aurobindo. Gebser was very much in that line, and Ken Wilber's in that line, and other people. But what I talk about in the book on curriculum is that what I focus on. See, I don't talk about Gebser and Jung in my books. I do have a chapter in the book on the teacher that does talk about Jung and Freud, but I really don't speak much about Gebser. Gebser is kind of behind the scenes in what I'm writing. So what I write about in that book is those three phases that the American it is, in fact, I would say a summation of the cultural consciousness of the United States at a particular time, and that which was propagated in the schools. The first period was from the first public education of about 1750 until 1918. And that was a period in which what they concentrated on in the educational system was acculturation. Culture was defined by the European Protestant. That was the American cultural identity. And the African Americans, the Indian, the Native Americans, the Asian Americans, the Hispanic Americans, they were all second class.
And women.
So, what?
And women.
And women, very much. And children, too, were just suppressed. And anyway. So then the next period, because of all of the immigration that happened in the early 1900s. And so they shifted. There was something called in 1918, the National Education Association, I guess it was under the Wilson administration, was commissioned to rewrite the cardinal principles of secondary education. Basically, that's what it's called. And that's a socialization document. And you see that socialization process in the educational system from about 1920 all the way to the mid 60s, I guess, sometime in the 60s. And then what had happened with after Sputnik went up, the Eisenhower administration had what they called the Educational Defense Act, and the Educational Defense Act transformed education with a much greater emphasis on the technology, the science, and mathematics, the STEM curriculum, what is now the STEM curriculum. I mean, some of you may remember in the Kennedy era, the big thing was the new math. Fortunately, I was just out of high school, so I didn't have to deal with that. But there was a lot of talk about the new math stuff. So we've been through those three periods. And what I'm saying is that we've been through those three periods, and now it's time for a new concept of education. And the new concept of education is this one that's based on Gebser and Jung. But what I've done is I put it in the mode of recapitulation theory, which is consistent with both Jung and Gebser. And my curriculum is basically based on that. I mean, I don't want to try to, at this point, really try to summarize the curriculum, but
You know,
but
we haven't talked yet about the world, you know, like nature, and where that fits into education, as you know, not just an antidote to the techno, but as an understanding of who we are as humans in relation to everything else. You know, like
Mhm.
in many ways, I think the all the various permutations of the educational system that you've described have assumed that like humans are at some central place in this. You know, it is our job to go and, you know, manipulate nature,
Manipulate everything, yeah.
to, you know, have business and, you know, supply chains and, you know, manufacturing and mining and all that stuff that but we don't, to my judgment anyway, educate students, people, human beings, to be just to be a being within you know, this greater field of life that we're in. Now I do see some hope for that with the increase in the number of forest schools in the US. I mean, 10 or more years ago, I visited a forest school in Switzerland and was just, you know, blown away by the freedom. Now, I mean, that's hard to do in New York City or Chicago or anything, you know, places like that.
Mhm.
But the whole approach to educating children was not like, we're going to mold you to acculturate, or we're going to mold you to assimilate, or anything like that. It was the kids kind of led the way toward their own education, and then when the opportunity to like teach something, they they would be taught. But it how do I describe this? It was more I guess to speak of it from a curricular perspective, the curriculum was fluid, and what would be taught when, like, the child expressed a desire, like, or there was an opportunity given what they were already doing.
Mm-hmm. That was called the child-centered education, and that was the basic downfall of the whole holistic education movement in the 70s and 80s, because they got too focused on that child-centered education. I had a student, I had a 7th grade student whose mother took him out of our school. I was teaching in a small private school and put him in one of those schools in Maryland, and it was awful. I mean, the kids were just running around doing nothing and not really learning very much. I think there has to be a rigorous structure to education, but not one that is focused on creating an individual, but one that's focused on the emergence of the individual, the emergence of the person, the emergence of humanity in another person. And that's
so that sounds like Adler. That sounds
Maybe,
like the Maieutic approach.
Well, there's a lot of that. There's Maslow's peak experiences, Maslow's what does he call it?
Robert, I have two questions.
Dead again.
Sorry.
Damn it.
Are you hearing me? I see a lot of parallel with what you're saying with the Rudolf Steiner's model of education. So I would like to know if you see any relation, or if Gebser has known Rudolf Steiner, at least his works.
Okay.
Where did you hear me?
Yeah, I'm back now. Yeah, my computer cut off for a minute.
Oh yeah, no. So I was asking you about the relation between Rudolf Steiner's model of education and Gebser. So that was my first question, because I myself was a student from a Waldorf school.
Oh yeah.
And I see many points that you're bringing out are central in the anthroposophic model. And my second question also was, here in Brazil, the main educator, one of the main educators was Paulo Freire.
Paulo Freire, yeah.
Yeah, who touched on the question of education and politics, education and capitalism. And I still think it's very important, because, I mean, even when we don't want to be political in education, the very act of not being political is a political act.
Yeah,
and we are all subjected to capitalism and to its domination. And so how is it for a child not to address those questions, to be conditioned by them just by them not being addressed at school? That was Freire's model. So yeah, those are my two questions.
Well, I don't know Paulo Freire's work very well. I mean, I know about him, but the concept of that you're speaking of, to me, sounds to me like what I define as a public trust of education. The public trust of education is focused on the occupational aspect, the socialization aspect, that sort of thing. And then there's a sacred trust of education, the sacred trust between the parent, the teacher, and the child. And that's about development of the personality and the character of the personality. So that would be my response to that particular question. And that the teacher's job is to find a balance between those two in the classroom. So you do teach all those things. You do teach all the political stuff. It's all there. I agree. Mm-hmm. But the teacher's job in the classroom is to be able to balance it. And one of the problems that we have in American education is that it's not balanced. there's too much emphasis on the public trust and not enough emphasis within the school community of allowing the teacher to express the archetype and to nurture the soul as well as teach the mind.
Mhm.
The other question about Gebser and Rudolf Steiner, yeah, that's very important. I was just going to ask you where you went to a Waldorf school, and I take you to Brazil.
No,
right?
that was in Paris. Yeah, that was
Yeah.
in France. It was in Paris.
Well, I did a lot of research into Gebser. I went to Gebser has not Gebser, Steiner's. There's a Steiner Academy in upstate New York that I went to, and did a weekend orientation there just to see what they're all about. And and then I went to a day-long program in Bethesda, Maryland, when I was living in Maryland, at a Waldorf school. They had a full day orientation for new parents and people who were interested, basically. So I went to that, and what I saw about in those particular instances, I'm not sure it's true universally, but in those two instances, what I saw about the Steiner model is that the Steiner model has become dogmatized. The Steiner model, yeah, the Rudolf Steiner said this, so we have to do it that way, and they've kind of
but it's not really this. It's more like Gebser was saying. When you describe the phases, all right. So, for example, you want to introduce certain things in the magical phase of the child, or you won't introduce certain things in the mythical phase because the inner structure of the person is not ready to receive that. That was Steiner's idea, not to create like fixed rules.
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually quite the same. I mean,
yeah,
similar.
ideologically it is. What I'm saying is about my experience with the school that I visited was that it's become too dogmatic.
That's quite possible. There is not a unique model for Steiner schools. Every school.
Yeah, Jung said the same thing about his own ideas. He said, "I'm glad I'm Jung, not a Jungian." Because the Jungians became dogmatic with his ideas. And I think that the same thing happened with Steiner. At least that was my experience in the one school I went to.
But what I wanted to ask you more specifically about this Paulo Freire is the question of the consciousness of class. Like, if you teach to very poor children, in a society that is capitalist, I mean, how are they going to be conscious that they are dominated? Because nobody gives this consciousness to them. I mean, of course, it's one may not agree to that, that's the question I'm asking, you see?
Well, in the educational system that I propose, the focus is on the sanctity of the individual. It doesn't matter what socioeconomic class you come from. And that's the whole thing about fairy tales. The fishmonger's daughter becomes the princess. The woodchopper's son becomes the heroic prince. That's the kind of thing that can happen with anybody in any socioeconomic position. If you teach that thing about the sanctity of the individual, the sacred aspect of the personality. There's a heroic archetype in the adolescent. And it doesn't matter what socioeconomic class they come from.
There was a teacher in Chicago who, Marva Collins, that was her name.
Oh yeah, Marva Collins in Chicago.
Yeah, and Jean-Michel, she taught in some of the poorest neighborhoods in Chicago, and her idea was you have to, as a teacher, hold the kids to, the highest ideal possible. So you don't go in there and say, oh, these are a bunch of poor kids in a poor neighborhood and they don't have the resources and they'll never be able to learn. She was like, no, I believe in you. You're going to learn this stuff. we're going to read Shakespeare, we're going to read the greats. And, you know, it was all about for her anyway, it was about basically believing so much in the kids that they come to believe in themselves.
Yes, I mean, I think it's wonderful, but the reality is still that all over the world, the people that go to university are not, mainly are not the people that come from this background. So it's a problem that has not been solved, right?
Yeah.
I think the context that also occurs to me in the overall context of our day's work, which is a very large canvas, shall we say. But when we think of education as a framing, we think of culture as a framing, the various ways we're framing things and to the best of our abilities. But just this one, and I'm often struck by it, of population growth. So when we talk about young people, it was not very long ago we were talking about X million human people in younger age group. And it's been extremely fast that demographic has exploded. So that when we're talking about the future of education, I mean, I believe the latest projection is peak world population at around 11 billion, 10 to 11 billion by about 2050, 2060, who knows? You can do the web search and get it. So we're talking about, with various models here, a vast number of young people. How do we even contemplate this? And I think your work, Robert, is very, very helpful in the contemplations of this. The teachers in any culture, any society, and as we say, any socioeconomic group whatsoever, where education exists, it is the teachers who are charged with a specific responsibility.
Absolutely.
How is that responsibility described? How is it administered? I was also a school administrator, and I don't wish that on anybody. It's a horrific thing to be an administrator in education, and it was much more horrific now. But at any rate, folks who say want to be truthful, who feel the calling of the teacher, who feel the archetype, if we'll use that language, and who accept that calling. And how is that going to play out as the transmutation of life on Earth accelerates in the coming 2 and 3 decades? I ask you.
I think more people need to step up and be teachers, not just a professional teacher class.
Well, that's why I advocate this concept of seeking the vocational archetype, because Stephen Herman, whom I mentioned in my talk, when I told him about my new book, he said he was very excited about it because his doctoral thesis was on the concept of teaching young people about seeking their archetype, seeking the archetype of their calling, whatever their calling is, rather than just focus on the skills to get a job, which is what most of the educational system is about today. He was talking then, when he did his doctoral thesis back in the 60s, about emphasizing the cultural, the occupational archetypes to the students in the class, at the secondary level and the college level. So I think that's a big part of recruiting the right people to be teachers. And then, as I said, my philosophy in the classroom is finding that balance between the things which belong to the public trust, the occupational part of it, the socialization part of it, and finding those things which belong to the sacred trust, which is the cultural identity and seeking your own highest potential. which is your possibility to individuate or integrate. Be an integral personality or an individuated personality, an individuated self, as Mike said.
I was just going to chime in and say, this thing about becoming a teacher that I find particularly concerning is that it's not only getting people who feel called, to that role, but also societally and politically that it is a role that is seen as being sacred within society, so that they are honored and treated well, so that it is, so that the very best people aspire to be teachers and want to do that vocation and feel it as their calling, as opposed to it becoming, which I am feeling that has happened with the pandemic and all the trials and tribulations, the political situation, where it's kind of the lowest common denominator, and it's like, who wants to go there? Who wants to do it? And when they're not paid particularly well, and I mean all the rest. So it seems to me like it's a big political issue as well as an educational, and as you've been talking about. Anyway,
it is a huge political issue. That's what I was saying about the conservatives and their push toward this classic academy that they call it, because education is such a huge political issue. And my argument with what's going on in the United States right now is the fact that the Democrats just avoid that subject like the plague. They don't want to talk about education. They just want things to keep on going the way they are. The Republicans are the only ones who are trying to change it, and I really don't agree with that, with the way they want to go either. But
right. Anyway, thank you, Robert.
Yes, thank you very much, Robert. I thank you always, and it's always good to connect with you and get your latest articulation. I also appreciate your statement of the recapitulation model, and I trust you are speaking of ontogeny repeating phylogeny.
Yeah, it recapitulates phylogeny. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, well, that's very fertile ground, exactly as you have said with both Jung and Gebser.
Absolutely.
But it is now 2:30, the end of our stated time, and we only took a half-hour break at lunch. But so we've been at work. It is 2:30 Pacific time. We will reconvene next Saturday at 10:30 Pacific time. Glenn will present, and then Jesse will present, and then Jean-Michel will present. And as we've had today, let's have good time for good conversation. And this is good. Again, keep in mind our thoughts, our imaginings of being together in person next year in New Mexico. Although I imagine we'll have to provide for hybrid, Glenn, assuming we can do that, but because hybrid is just expected now. It's almost exclusionary to tell somebody, well, you can't connect